17 Black R&B legends who are worst jerks in history. They were the voices that once defined an era. Men and women whose songs could melt hearts and move nations. The soundtrack of Black America's rise through rhythm and soul. But when the lights went dark and the applause faded, the truth wasn't always so sweet. Behind those velvet vocals were shattered mirrors, fists flying backstage, love songs hiding control and betrayal, secret cameras rolling where no one should have been, and police sirens chasing fame down the freeway. And would you believe, one of these legends married his best friend's widow, only to fall into a forbidden affair with her daughter years later. When that truth surfaced, the entire R&B world stood frozen in disbelief. In this video, we pulled back the curtain on 17 R&B icons. Artists who made history with their voices, but left behind scars that even time can't heal. Rick James. Rick James, the rebel wrapped in flames. If James Brown was the godfather of soul, then Rick James was the outlaw prince of funk, wild, untamed, and burning with raw desire. In the 1980s, he reigned as the sound of rebellion, a glittering symbol of sexual freedom and defiance. On stage, he was electric, a storm of sweat, sequins, and sin. But the brighter he burned, the faster he consumed himself in addiction, violence, and delusions of power. It was a scorching July night in 1991, deep in the hills of Laurel Canyon. Inside Rick's lavish mansion, purple lights glowed against mirrored walls, and the bass shook the floor until dawn. Rick, hair braided and eyes bloodshot, floated through the crowd in a crimson velvet robe like a fallen king. Beside him was Tanya Hijazi, young, beautiful, and cold-eyed, the kind of woman who could read danger before it spoke. What happened that night remains clouded in whispers. Some say Rick snapped when a woman refused his drink. Others swore they heard screams upstairs, muffled by pounding music and locked doors. By morning, the woman emerged, bruised, hollow-eyed, wrapped in a coat too big for her frame. And when the story broke, the music world froze in disbelief. But the chaos didn't stop there. While awaiting trial, Rick found himself in another violent episode, this time in a West Hollywood hotel. He invited a woman to listen to a demo. When she said she didn't like it, rage took over. A cassette player smashed against the wall, hair was pulled, and fear filled the room. 2 women, 2 nights, 2 warnings ignored. Rick James, once the electrifying pulse of an entire generation, had lost control. Addiction had devoured the artist and left behind a man ruled by paranoia and power. In 1993, the verdict came. Nearly 3 years in prison. And when Rick entered in an orange jumpsuit, hair unkempt, eyes dim, there was no super freak left. Only a man who'd burned his own legend to ash. Somewhere between the music, the madness, and the mirror, Rick James lost the one thing even fame couldn't buy back: himself. James Brown, the genius in handcuffs. In the 1960s and 70s, there wasn't a single black household in America that didn't know the name James Brown. With explosive hits like I Got You, I Feel Good, and Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, he didn't just sing R&B. He redefined it. Every beat bowed to his rhythm. Every stage trembled beneath his feet. Under the hot lights, he was the godfather of soul, a living engine of sound, a symbol of black pride, power, and awakening. But behind those flashing lights and tailored suits lived a darker James, controlling, paranoid, and consumed by rage. By the 1970s, his brilliance was clouded by heavy drug use that twisted his mind with hallucinations and suspicion. Family members recalled nights when he'd jolt awake, convinced someone was watching or plotting against him. Those delusions often exploded into violence, most tragically toward his wife, Adrienne, who endured years of abuse and hospital visits. In 1994, she broke her silence, accusing him publicly of domestic violence. Court records painted a chilling portrait of a man at war with himself, fueled by jealousy, cocaine, and a need for control. Even his bandmates weren't spared. On stage, Brown ruled with an iron fist. One missed note could cost you your paycheck. One wrong look could end your career. He didn't need love, one musician said quietly. He needed fear. Then came September 24th, 1988, a day that would shatter the myth of the man they once called the pride of the South. In Augusta, Georgia, James Brown stormed into an insurance office carrying a shotgun, enraged over something almost absurd. Someone had used the bathroom he believed was reserved only for him. Witnesses said his eyes were wild, his voice thunderous. Workers screamed, ducked under desks, and called the police as Brown fled the scene in his pickup truck, tearing through state lines like a man possessed. Sirens wailed behind him, a requiem for a legend in free fall. When police finally stopped him, they had to shoot out his tires. Even then, James fought back, rambling incoherently as officers dragged him away. The mugshot that followed, hair unkempt, eyes glassy, spirit broken, became the haunting symbol of a fallen king. Convicted of illegal firearm possession, reckless driving, and endangering the public, James Brown was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He served just over 2.5 for good behavior. But the image of the godfather of soul, handcuffed and defeated, would forever mark the end of his reign and the beginning of his redemption's impossible question. Can a man who gave the world so much rhythm ever escape the silence of his own sins? Al Green, the angel who fell from grace. Al Green once embodied everything pure about 1970s soul. His velvet-smooth voice, his radiant smile, and timeless anthems like Let's Stay Together made him the soundtrack of love itself. To the world, he was the gentleman of R&B, refined, spiritual, and devoted. But behind that honeyed voice was a man torn between faith and flesh, leaving behind scars far deeper than the melodies he sang. On a quiet October night in 1974, inside his modest Memphis home, the illusion shattered. As Al relaxed in his bathroom, his girlfriend, Mary Woodson, walked in, holding a pot of scalding water. Without warning, she threw it over him. The boiling liquid seared his skin, his screams echoing through the house and out into the Tennessee night. Neighbors rushed to call for help, but within moments, tragedy deepened. Mary retrieved Al's own gun and ended her life on the spot. The scene was chaos. The media descended like vultures. A woman consumed by love, betrayal, and despair had turned their romance into a real-life Greek tragedy. And soon, the truth surfaced. Mary had just discovered that Al had secretly married another woman. In her diary, she wrote of betrayal, deception, and being treated like a shadow in the life of a man she once thought divine. That night marked the death of Al Green's angelic image. The boiling water didn't just burn his skin, it stripped away the sanctified mask America adored. Though he later found redemption as a pastor, singing hymns of forgiveness and faith, the scars remained, both on his body and on the legacy of a man who once sang of eternal love, only to betray it in the cruelest way imaginable. R. Kelly. R. Kelly, the self-proclaimed king of R&B who became the most disgraced figure in modern music. Once celebrated for timeless anthems like I Believe I Can Fly, Ignition, Remix, and Step in the Name of Love, he ruled the airwaves and defined an era of soul-soaked romance. But behind the platinum records and white suits, a monster was quietly building an empire of control, manipulation, and abuse that would horrify the world. Whispers began in the late 1990s, stories of underage girls, secret encounters, and settlements that never made headlines. Then in 2002, a leaked tape exposed him in the most shocking way imaginable. But the trial dragged on for years, lost in technicalities and celebrity privilege. The world moved on. He didn't stop. Everything changed in 2019 when the documentary Surviving R. Kelly ripped open the truth, revealing a twisted network of psychological and physical abuse, a so-called sex cult that destroyed lives while the industry turned a blind eye. By 2022, justice finally caught up. Kelly was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The man who once inspired millions to believe they could fly became a symbol of everything broken in fame and power. Today, his songs echo differently. not as hymns of hope, but as chilling reminders of a fallen king who crashed from grace. Ike Turner, the abuser who refused to admit it. Ike Turner, the Mississippi-born prodigy who helped invent rock and roll with Rocket 88, was a man of staggering talent and terrifying darkness. As one half of the explosive duo Ike and Tina Turner, he ruled R&B through the 60s and 70s, commanding stages with his fiery guitar and iron control. But behind the roar of amplifiers and flashing lights was a man who thrived on domination. A genius in music, a tyrant in love. Then came the night of 1976 at the Statler Hilton Hotel in Dallas. It began like any other post-show routine until the violence erupted again. Inside their Cadillac, Ike struck Tina. This time, the blow was so fierce it drew blood. And in that moment, as he turned away, Tina made the choice that would rewrite her destiny. She ran, barefoot, bruised, and broke across a Dallas highway. No money, no luggage, no safety net, only the will to survive. She found refuge in a small motel, and from that night on, she was free. Ike's fall was slow and public. Without Tina, his empire crumbled. Addiction consumed him, and scandal followed wherever he went. In 1989, he landed behind bars on drug charges. Yet even then, he denied it all. "I never hit Tina. She made it up," he claimed. But Tina's autobiography, I, Tina, and countless witnesses told a very different story. When What's Love Got to Do with It hit theaters in 1993, the world finally saw the truth, the brutality behind the music. By the time Ike died of a cocaine overdose in 2007, any hope of redemption had vanished. His music remains, but his legacy is stained forever, a reminder that genius means nothing when it's fueled by cruelty. Bobby Womack, the scoundrel of soul. Bobby Womack wasn't just a singer, he was a storm. That gritty baritone behind Across 110th Street, and If You Think You're Lonely, now made him one of the most electrifying soul men of the 1970s. But for every note of genius he hit, there was a decision that shook his world and nearly destroyed it. It all began with tragedy. In 1964, when America mourned the death of soul legend Sam Cooke, a young Bobby stood weeping by the casket, mourning not just a mentor, but a man who had become like family. But less than 3 months later, that same grief turned into scandal. On March 5th, 1965, in a quiet Los Angeles church, 21-year-old Bobby Womack married Barbara Cooke, Sam's widow, 10 years his senior. The sight of the two hand in hand left fans speechless. There were no explanations, no apologies, just a wedding band and a smile that set the press ablaze. Sam's family felt betrayed. Radio stations banned his records. Newspapers branded him a traitor. Overnight, Bobby became soul music's most hated man. But his troubles didn't end there. In 1970, Barbara discovered he was having an affair with Linda, her and Sam's teenage daughter. The revelation ignited chaos inside their Los Angeles home. In a fit of rage, Barbara grabbed a gun and fired. The bullet grazed Bobby's cheek, leaving a scar that told a story words could never erase. Once seen as Sam Cooke's chosen successor, Bobby became a man haunted by his own choices, a soul prodigy turned pariah. Those songs like Across 110th Street and If You Think You're Lonely Now would later redeem his artistry. His legacy was forever marked by one question. Was Bobby Womack a musical genius or a man who sold his soul? Chuck Berry, the guitar legend and the secrets behind the bathroom door. Chuck Berry, born in 1926 in St. Louis, wasn't just a pioneer of rock and roll. He defined it. With hits like Johnny B., Good and Maybelline, he turned rhythm and blues into rebellion, his guitar riffs echoing through jukeboxes and teenage hearts across America. He was the bridge between church rhythm and teenage chaos, a black man kicking open the doors of a segregated industry and showing the world what real swagger sounded like. But for all his brilliance, Berry's light came with shadows. In 1961, at the height of his fame, he was arrested under the Mann Act, accused of transporting an underage girl across state lines to work at his club. Berry insisted he was just helping her find a job, but the jury didn't believe him. The rock star who once ruled the stage now found himself behind bars, stripped of his guitar, his reputation, and the adoration of millions. You'd think that kind of fall would humble a man. But 3 decades later, another scandal would shake his legacy to the core. In December 1990, female employees at his restaurant, the Southern Air, filed a lawsuit claiming they'd been secretly filmed in the women's restroom. At first, it sounded unbelievable. But when police searched Barry's home in Wentzville, Missouri, they discovered over 60 videotapes, each containing footage no one should ever have seen. Though Barry was never criminally convicted, he paid out hundreds of thousands in settlements. And while he continued to perform until the end of his life, the crowd's cheers were never quite the same. Behind the grin and the duck walk, the legend of Chuck Berry would forever carry a dark, uneasy echo, proof that even the fathers of rock and roll can fall from grace. Marvin Gaye, the dark side of a heavenly voice. Marvin Gaye wasn't just the Prince of Motown. He was its conscience. A man whose voice could make love sound holy and heartbreak feel redemptive. He gave soul music a new purpose, transforming it from sweet romance to powerful social reflection. But behind that velvet tone lived a storm no melody could calm. By the mid-1970s, Marvin's world was unraveling. Fame had become a lonely cage. He turned to drugs to escape the silence that followed the applause, sinking deeper into paranoia and despair. One night in October 1977, inside his Hollywood Hills mansion, the darkness took over. Suspicion and cocaine coursed through his veins as he accused his wife Janice of betrayal. Over nothing more than a glance exchanged with a party guest. He locked the bedroom door, turned up Trouble Man to a mocking volume, and began to spiral. Janice sat trembling on the edge of the bed, tears catching the dim light as Marvin muttered to himself through the music. Those nights became routine, hours of rage, monologues, and isolation behind studio walls that could no longer contain the chaos. Friends stopped calling. Collaborators drifted away. Even family kept their distance. Marvin was left alone with his demons. Unfinished songs, cocaine-stained notes, and an unbearable loneliness echoing through the house. On April 1st, 1984, after a heated argument in his parents' Los Angeles home, tragedy struck. In a moment of rage and heartbreak, his father shot him with the very gun Marvin had bought to protect the family. The man who once asked the world, "What's going on?" left without finding the answer himself. A genius silenced, not by the industry, but by the weight of his own sorrow. Sly Stone, the rise and ruin of a rebel visionary. Sly Stone wasn't just a musician. He was a revolution in motion. As the fearless frontman of Sly and the Family Stone, he tore down barriers by blending black, white, male, and female performers into one electric force. With anthems like Everyday People and Dance to the Music, Sly didn't just make people groove. He made a divided America listen. His message was unity. His sound was freedom. But behind the dazzling colors and euphoric rhythms, darkness brewed. Even as the spotlight burned bright, Sly carried more than just his mic. He carried drugs, paranoia, and a loaded gun beneath his sparkling coat. By the mid-70s, his shows had become unpredictable carnivals of chaos. In San Francisco, Detroit, New Orleans, fans waited for hours, sometimes in vain. Then came Oakland, 1978. The crowd roared as the band kicked off the intro. Sly stumbled onto the stage, eyes glassy, smile vacant. Mid-song, he crumpled to the floor, muttering, laughing, then walking away without a word. The music died. The dream shattered. One by one, his bandmates quit, and the man who once preached harmony became the symbol of disarray. By 2010, the New York Post found him living in a broken-down van behind a parking lot near Crenshaw Boulevard, surrounded by old tapes, scribbled lyrics, and fading memories of a brighter time. "I'm still writing music," he said softly. But the voice that once united a nation now whispered from the shadows, a genius lost in the echo of his own creation. George Clinton, genius or greedy power king? George Clinton wasn't just a musician. He was an architect of another universe. The wild-haired visionary behind Parliament Funkadelic didn't just blend R&B, soul, and funk. He turned them into a psychedelic religion called P-Funk, where rhythm ruled and he was the god at the center. But behind the neon wigs, motherships, and mind-bending grooves, there was a darker rhythm, one of control, ego, and betrayal. By the late 1980s, as the funk empire began to crumble, the cracks started to show. Former members like drummer Jerome, Bigfoot, Brayley, and singer Fuzzy Haskins came forward with shocking claims. Stolen royalties, fraudulent contracts, and money funneled straight into Clinton's pockets. In September 1987, at a tense meeting inside a small Atlanta hotel, the so-called Funk family tried to confront their leader. Clinton strolled in hours late, wrapped in a sequined robe, wearing a purple wig like a crown. When one member dared to ask about the missing royalties, Clinton slammed the table and growled, "There's only one father here, and it's me." The room fell silent. In that moment, the family they had built around music and freedom shattered. What followed was a decade of lawsuits stretching from New York to Los Angeles. Clinton denied every accusation, but the evidence, the contracts, the bank records, the testimonies painted a different picture. He wasn't just the band's leader. He was the gatekeeper to every dollar they ever earned. And yet, even as his reputation darkened, Clinton kept the show going, performing through the 2000s, collecting awards, and basking in legendary status. To fans, he remained the funk godfather. But to many who once shared the stage with him, George Clinton wasn't a savior of funk. He was its ruthless king. Ronald Isley, the debt-ridden gentleman obsessed with luxury. Ronald Isley, the velvet voice behind the Isley Brothers, was the soundtrack of seduction. His smooth vocals on between the sheets and For the Love of You defined R&B romance for generations. With his tailored suits, diamond cufflinks, and ever-present shades, he looked every inch the refined gentleman of soul. But beneath the polished exterior hid a financial nightmare. On a sweltering Friday afternoon in June 2003, IRS agents arrived at Isley's Beverly Hills mansion. In their hands, a thick folder packed with unpaid invoices, phony bank accounts, and years of creative accounting. In the driveway sat a gleaming Bentley beside a vintage Rolls-Royce, neither of which had ever seen a tax receipt. Inside, a half-empty glass of wine and cigarette ashes lingered on the dining table, remnants of a life lived larger than the truth. Behind the music, Isley had been drowning in debt, performing for sold-out crowds while quietly evading millions in taxes. The illusion of wealth couldn't last forever. In October 2006, the man once known as Mr. Biggs walked out of a Los Angeles courtroom not as a superstar, but as a convict, sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for tax evasion. His voice remained timeless, but the legend of the R&B gentleman had cracked, one headline at a time. Michael Jackson, angel or monster? Can you believe that Michael Jackson, the man who bridged the gap between classic soul and modern pop, the king of pop himself, belongs on this list too? Behind the dazzling lights and moonwalks was a storm that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In August 1993, inside Neverland Ranch, his dreamlike estate once described as a paradise for children, a chilling accusation surfaced. A young boy named Jordan Chandler and his father filed a lawsuit claiming Michael had crossed sacred boundaries no one should ever cross. The headlines erupted overnight. Michael Jackson, angel or demon? Half the world wept for the fallen star of their childhood. The other half whispered, was there a dark truth behind Neverland's gates? Michael was never criminally charged, but the world watched as he quietly settled the case out of court for $23 million. From that day on, his image was never the same. Then came 2005, another trial, another wave of cameras, and 4 brutal months in court. Though he was acquitted, the man who once made the world dance now seemed like a ghost of himself, haunted, fragile, and forever shadowed by doubt. David Ruffin, the superstar consumed by his own ego. David Ruffin was born in 1941, and from the moment he stepped onto the stage, his voice carried the kind of fire that could melt souls. As the golden voice behind My Girl, he He didn't just sing. He commanded every spotlight. To millions, he was the heart of the Temptations. But beneath that smooth velvet tone burned a dangerous hunger, the kind that devours its own brilliance. By the summer of 1967, the fame had twisted him. During a tour stop in Chicago, Ruffin demanded the group rename itself David Ruffin and the Temptations. When the others refused, he exploded, smashing mirrors backstage at the Regal Theater, refusing to perform, and leaving 2,000 fans in stunned chaos. His brothers in music had seen enough. The charm had curdled into arrogance, the genius into madness. At home, the storm only grew darker. His girlfriend, Motown's sweetheart Tammy Terrell, began appearing with bruises on her arms and face. One night at a Detroit party, after seeing her smile at another man, Ruffin hurled a glass of liquor in her face. Witnesses said her eyes looked as if they'd lost all light. By 1968, he was gone from the Temptations, fired without ceremony, exiled from the empire he helped build. His solo career stumbled, dragged down by addiction, rage, and regret. The man who once sang of pure love was now consumed by self-destruction. On June 1, 1991, in a small Philadelphia hospital, David Ruffin died alone of a drug overdose. No spotlight, no applause, just silence. To fans of R&B, his story remains a haunting truth. When unchecked genius meets unchecked ego, it burns brighter than anyone else, but never for long. Prince, the tyrant who ruled his own purple kingdom. In the world of 1980s and 90s R&B, he wasn't just a star. He was a force of nature, a one-man empire who wrote, produced, arranged, and played nearly every instrument himself. But behind that genius was a man feared as much as he was admired. To those who worked with him, Prince was distant, demanding, and utterly unyielding. One wrong note, one misplaced look, and you were out. In 1993, when Warner Brothers, the label that helped build his empire, tried to control his release schedule, Prince declared war. He sued them, abandoned his own name, and emerged with an unpronounceable symbol, a defiant gesture that made headlines worldwide. The world mocked him as the artist formerly known as Prince, a rebel with a purple guitar and an ego to match. But in his mind, the true betrayal came not from his label, but from a world that refused to let him be free. Those who worked backstage said Prince rarely acknowledged anyone beneath his rank. He demanded to be addressed as Sir and forced his team to labor through the night over a single drum sound he said wasn't purple enough. One former assistant confessed he didn't want colleagues, he wanted servants. When Prince died in 2016, the world mourned the loss of a musical deity. Yet for some who stood in his shadow, the memory was far more complex. A portrait of brilliance and tyranny intertwined, of a man whose stare could silence a studio and whose perfectionism left no room for mercy. Bobby Brown, the man who had it all and lost it just as fast. In the late 80s and early 90s, he was R&B's wild prince, a hitmaker with swagger, sex appeal, and attitude. With chart-topping songs like My Prerogative and Don't Be Cruel, Bobby wasn't just making music, he was rewriting what it meant to be a superstar. But behind the fame and flashing lights, chaos was brewing. As his fame soared, his personal life spiraled into scandal. His turbulent marriage to Whitney Houston, once hailed as a union of two icons, became a storm of control, addiction, and heartbreak. In the 2018 documentary Whitney, her family described Bobby as volatile and manipulative, a man who pulled her deeper into the same darkness that eventually consumed them both. In 2003, he was arrested in Georgia for assaulting Whitney so severely she had to be hospitalized, one of many arrests that followed, from public brawls to DUIs. Each headline chipped away at his once glittering image. The world watched as the bad boy of R&B became his own worst enemy. By the time the music faded, Bobby Brown's legacy wasn't defined by his hits, but by the haunting story of a man undone by ego, excess, and the very fame he once craved. Otis Redding Jr., living in the shadow of a legend. He was born with a name that carried weight, one too heavy for any man to bear. Otis Redding Jr., son of the soul legend himself, had the voice, the charm, even the raw spark of greatness, but not the discipline to hold it together. In the ruthless world of R&B, talent alone isn't enough. And for Otis Jr., the pressure to live up to his father's legacy became both his driving force and his undoing. While he found modest recognition in local circles, he never managed to escape the long, haunting shadow of the Redding name. Behind the music and the promise of fame lay a darker reality, one filled with rage, jealousy, and self-destruction. After his death in 2007, disturbing stories surfaced. Family members spoke of heavy drinking, violent outbursts, and reckless behavior that tore his home apart. One chilling memory stood out. A relative recalled him locking his young son in a dark room for playing Marvin Gaye, a singer Otis Jr. saw as his imaginary rival. In the end, it wasn't fate that erased his name from the spotlight. It was his own choices. A man consumed by envy, buried beneath the very shadow he could never escape. Teddy Pendergrass, the night the mask fell. In the 1970s, Teddy wasn't just an R&B star. He was the fantasy. The voice that melted hearts, the body that made crowds scream. To millions of black women, he was pure fire, the dangerous blend of Luther Vandross's passion and Marvin Gaye's sensuality. On stage, Teddy was desire in motion. But behind the velvet suits and sold-out shows, another story was waiting to explode. On March 18, 1982, in Philadelphia, Teddy took his brand-new Rolls-Royce out for a late-night drive. Beside him sat a mysterious woman named Tanika Watson. Moments later, the car spun out of control and slammed into a tree. Teddy survived, but the man who walked onto stages was gone forever. Paralyzed from the chest down, he would never perform the same again. Then came a question everyone whispered. Who was the passenger? When it emerged that Tanika was a transgender woman, the R&B world erupted. In an industry already stained with prejudice, Teddy's silence only deepened the scandal. Rumors swirled of manipulation, betrayal, and reckless indulgence. Insiders claimed this crash wasn't an accident, but the inevitable result of a life spiraling out of control. That night, it wasn't just a Rolls-Royce that crashed. It was the golden illusion of the perfect man. And though Teddy would rise again, performing from his wheelchair with soul and courage, the shadow of that night never left him. He never explained it fully. He only said, "That crash was the harshest lesson of my life." Like so many secrets buried in the glittering world of R&B, the truth may have died on that Philadelphia road in 1982. We've seen it before: James Brown in handcuffs, Rick James in court, Marvin Gaye facing his father's gun. Legends consumed by the same spotlight that once crowned them. Because in the end, the light that builds a legend can also expose everything they try to hide. So tell us, did you ever idolize them? And now that you know the truth, can you still forgive them? Stay tuned. The next story might be even darker.